Welcome to our final lecture in this particular unit. By now you're all quite busy trying to get your assessment done for the deadline on Friday the 29th. So no doubt you're working hard and are committed. So let's have a look at this week's topic. It's about resourcing learners. And the focus for this week is on your professional challenge as a teacher and a teacher of science. To find your place in your career and also into the emerging professional futures to which teachers are indelibly committed and subscribed. So let's have a look at what we're going to talk about this week. We're actually going to begin by taking a zoom out to the future. We're going to have a look at a helicopter view of what the world might be in the year 2030. And the reason we're doing this is because we're going to question the role of science, the role of science education, what community and society may look like in that particular time, and more importantly, what your professional career will look like in a simple 12-year period. So these are the types of developments that the education fraternity are planning on implementing and also planning on coming about. Now, some of them are beyond our control. So if we have a look at what's happening globally, the world's population will be 8.5 billion people at that particular point in time. We can look at the global temperatures, an average of 1.2 degrees Celsius higher than the year 1880. This means seas have risen 40 centimetres since 2016, which is higher than the existing models in 2016 actually predicted. We already know that in 2017. So the 2 metre rise by the year 2050 is dramatically understated. We are going to see much quicker, much more elaborate and much more fast-tracked global sea rises than we're predicting. The Arctic Ocean is now ice-free every summer by the year 2030, and several countries have lost their primary freshwater sources as the glaciers melt and saltwater floods flat lands. Many cities have been damaged by climatic events, and we're seeing that in Mexico at the moment. We're seeing it right across the Honduras, right across the Americas. And by the year 2030, we're going to have 40 million environmental refugees settled in countries away from their homelands. Now, can you imagine the transition there? Because what we're seeing in Myanmar at the moment with the Rohingya, we're seeing violent backlash. And this is coming from host countries and the resentment of refugees. And we don't even have to look that far a sea, do we? I mean, we've got Manus Island, and we've got our own little sad stories there about refugee backlash. We're seeing flooding and disasters costing billions of dollars annually, and this is going to deplete many national accounts of countries large and small. So we're starting to see a shift in spending away from critical social infrastructure and investment, and it's going to be diverted to foreign aid, to local aid, to emergency aid, and also to repair and maintenance of cities and towns and roads and bridges and all of these infrastructure that's going to be depleted as a result of climatic challenge. Schools are also going to face a cutback in funding along with all this other funding because, let's face it, our population's getting older, our tax base is getting smaller, so our institutions and our infrastructure is going to be less elaborately funded. So it's going to get a cutback. We're going to see a cutback in the number of teachers with paid positions. We're going to therefore see a cutback in the instructional hours that will be available to students. And we're seeing this now. We've got it in schools down on the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast, where the school opens in the morning for primary students and then opens in the afternoon for senior students. Opens in the morning for students up to year 9 and opens in the afternoon for senior students. So instructional hours are being cut. So will the total year numbers of schooling, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. We're going to try and get as much schooling as we get done now in less years, therefore reducing the cost. But in some regions, schools can see this now. Schools can see it and they're planning. Some educational ministries are actually on the ball. And so some regions, the convergence of economic, environmental, social crises are leading to educational reform. We're starting to see new programs and priorities. We're starting to see new curricula and new types of schools. For instance, in Bali, there's the Green School, renowned globally for its renewal policies and its renewal strategies. Here in Queensland, if you look at junior education and you just Google the opportunities available there for green or sustainable education, you will see so many little community schools popping up everywhere in Queensland. So we're starting to see this. It's happening now. And what we're looking at is a new educational path better adapted to life on a changing planet. So here's the story. At the beginning of 2017, applications for teacher education courses plummeted by 40%. By the year 2030, the number of positions available to teachers will also plummet. Education as a public good is going to change dramatically as a result of the changes in a changing world. It's not all doom and gloom. We can head back to the future. And here's some of the stuff that's coming out of Canada and the US and also out of the UK in terms of what the role of teachers can look like as we move forward into this new millennia, and particularly around about the year 2030, we're expecting to see some significant changes. Put your seatbelt on. This might surprise some of you. 2030, a discussion that what we call the Equinox Summit, held in Canada every year, where leading educators and education planners come together and they actually look at the future of Canadian education. Now, in Canada, teaching is a lifelong profession. In Canada, you have to compete to get into teaching. It's like Finland. Teachers are esteemed people. Okay, they really are well valued and they attract the highest graduates. So when they get together for their Equinox Summit, the government listens. Here's the 4 things that have come out of the Equinox Summit recently. And I'm looking at 4 significant changes that are going to happen to schools by the year 2030. This summit predicts there'll be no grades, there'll be no examinations, and there'll be no or fewer limited teachers. Let's look at the first one. We're moving very quickly towards stage-based, not age-based learning. So what this means is getting rid of grades 9 to 12 and replacing them with a project-based system. In other words, once you get to year 9, you elect to follow a project, and in that project you build a portfolio, and that portfolio reflects a dynamic range of what your assessment will be and the sorts of strengths and the brand that you put on yourself as a student and learner. Why? Because when we look at it, students would learn as they progress through material and not be held back simply or because of their age. Okay? I mean, all of a sudden you're 13, that constitutes entry to a certain grade level. Okay, what if you were 11 and you're extremely bright and you're on a vertically integrated curricula? Okay, the new stage-based learning, okay, is not age-based. We're moving much more towards ability. And the benefit here, of course, is the time that students spend in school is not dependent on their age, but on their ability to perform. So we're starting to see one quantum shift away from structured, age-based year levels. Stage-based learning is also the focus of the second shift, and we're looking at a movement towards project-based learning. And the reason why is because we've got high levels of disengagement being reported in education right across the world. We're talking about STEM, technology-based futures, but what we're seeing is a dramatic drop-off in learners at both secondary and at university levels in science-related courses. So our society potentially is facing a real dilemma here. Disengagement, and it's happening to high as well as low-performing students because they're being forced to learn things in an age-based curriculum that doesn't challenge them, that doesn't interest them, okay, that doesn't tap into their passions. And the benefit here, of course, is we're going to try and close the door to underachievement by creating stage-based learnings. Once we add to stage-based learning, we look at the notion of a qualitative portfolio assessment. Notice that, qualitative. So there's no grades, there's no quantitative grade. So how does this work? Well, teachers are able to record accomplishments on certain tasks without a quantitative value. Okay, so much more descriptive, much more rubric-based assessment, and this assessment may, for instance, involve professional communities and people out there in the community. So we are talking about industry-relevant, community-relevant, socially relevant assessment strategies, not just little tasks the teacher gets the student to do in their own lunchbox. Why is this happening? Because it allows students to be autonomous in pursuing their passions. If I have a gifted IT or robotics student and they're in year 9, well, why shouldn't they be sitting in a university lecture theatre, talking about complex systems, looking at integrated circuitries, building robotic models? Why shouldn't they be if they have the ability? The benefit? We're getting rid of examinations, and it moves the pressure, and we'll talk a little bit more about this soon. It removes the pressure from students to conform to what is being examined. We're seeing this with NAPLAN. We're seeing it in the States with standardised assessment. These are major shifts and major changes. The final thing to come out of the Equinox Summit is including non-government organisations, private organisations and the public in the schooling process. At the moment it's too closed. What happens in schools stays in schools, and that is wrong, because the consequences The scholastic identity that a student develops in schools travels with them through life. We need to bring these organisations into schools in ways that actually integrate that scholastic identity. This will be done by networking and engagement, and it's already happening. And why are we doing this? Because we're helping, schools and students face the realities of the world through more than the perspective of a single teacher. I know Mrs. Jones is a balanced person. I know she has a lovely fluffy dog. I know she feeds her cat and cares for her animals well. But let's face it, she's one single teacher. Students need more than that, and they need it from very early ages. They need multiple inputs and multiple exposure. And students are already exposed from everything. The benefit here, they're exposed to everything from propaganda to partisan politics. And one of the biggest challenges facing schools, how much resources do schools spend on not making access available to students for various things? It's a negative cost. And it's a negative benefit. We are going to deny access to social media. We're going to deny access to this, to that, to the other. The reason being, it's nonsense. Students are already exposed to this. Let's bring it into the classroom. Let's educate about it. Let's create critical thinking students. And the Equinox Summit is moving towards that. Keep your eyes on Canada. Keep your eyes on Finland. You will see that teachers in Canada and Finland, report really low levels of occupational stress. Think about that. Maybe there's something good about the system they're developing. So the problem with schooling, and there are many, and this is not to beat up on schooling, but we're looking at the future, because schooling's at an impasse at the moment, and students in particular. We're going to deal with student perspectives. They experience a clear divide between schooling and learning, and let's not confuse them. They're quite different things. Often something that's learnt is not what's taught, and often something that's taught is not what's learned. Think about some of the bad teachers you've had yourself. Okay, no matter what they tried to teach you, you couldn't do it. Okay, you couldn't go there with them. And again, this is one of the problems with schooling. There is a breakdown between schooling and learning. Our current assessment models constrain ambition and the pursuit of passion. So you get to a senior level in year 11 or 12, and you've got to do 5 assessment tasks. Why? Couldn't you design a task and then do 5 significant portfolio elements around that of your own choice and design? School has limited the understanding of reality in the real world. In other words, we break it down into silos called subjects. There's very little integration, and we're not working towards integrating, external, professional, important, political, socioeconomic views into the school. It's all about the curriculum. In the past few decades, school has succeeded in only one aspect, and this comes out of a study in the United States. It's managed to successfully decouple itself from the idea of learning. Isn't that a frightening concept? We're going into a world that's changing dramatically, which requires people to think differently and behave differently, and that's not a consumer identity that we're asking them to pick up here. We're asking them to pick up, a very Aristotelian concept of the citizen, be very different people to we are at the moment. And yet here we have a school system that continues to divorce itself from learning and from real learning outcomes. This is not me talking. This is the research coming out of the Imagine 2030 project in schools. And what will we see? We're going to see new teaching and learning ecologies. So we're going to be combining teaching expertise with new discoveries in brain research and cutting-edge technology. So, a lot of different changes coming up. Artificial intelligence, visual goggles, all of these kinds of things will become quite strong, quite kinesthetic educational tools. And we are looking at a situation where every single student is going to have a fine-tuned personal education plan. And this will come about as a rise in our discovery about brain research and the sorts of programs students need to do. Schools as community hubs. We're going to see, community hubs. We're going to see schools come back to life. They're going to be seamless connections in and out of cyberspace. Teachers, students, families will be combined with local and distant professional bodies, volunteers, businesses, and they'll be working on activities, real activities that benefit the entire community. And we'll start to see students and learners stay in their communities as they become engaged citizens again through this kind of hub model, this hub process, a little bit like the Greek Senate and the Roman Senate, where the people involved in those senates became community leaders, became community pillars. And we're starting to see innovative teachers looking at career pathways. A little bit of flexibility. Instead of burning teachers out over 40 weeks a year, get teachers involved in a half-time teaching job and have another half-time role in another organisation. It could be a community one, it could be a business, that benefits students. So we're getting a broad perspective. This is one of the ways we're going to bring that perspective into schools. And this is what the Imagine 2030 project's talking about. This is what schools are going to look like. This is obviously what science is going to look like in science education. And the resources, the focus of this week's lecture, the resources that we provide for our learners are very much going to reflect our individual philosophy on education and schooling, and also on science. And I go here to one of my favourite quotes from Oscar Wilde, and it is The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where he states, "A map of the world does not include utopia, is not even worth glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing." Now, it's a brilliant quote. Where has utopia gone in our planning? If we look at the 2030 documentations, it's strongly present. We're looking at smaller schools, more dynamic schools, more flexible schools. For example, how far are we away from that? Well, it's happening already. Community schools are popping up everywhere. We've got Reggio Emilia, we've got international baccalaureate schools. Okay, we've got Steiner schools. We've got the Charters Towers schools of distance education. Not well known, but it's Queensland's largest school. And yet, it only delivers distance education to 12.5% of its population who are basically in remote areas. And that was its original charter, to deliver education to remote stations, to remote outback provinces. But only 12.5% of its population fits that original charter. So we're looking at very new schools. We're looking at this evolution is already begun. Some questions for science. And here's a couple for you to think about. Question number 1, why can't any of our global telcos get indemnity insurance from Lloyd's of London or Allianz, the world's two big insurers? Think about that. Question number 2, let's get a local one. Since 1973, the average Aussie bloke's sperm count has dropped by 49%. Where does the man in your house carry his mobile phone? Question number 3, why have schools in Cyprus withdrawn Wi-Fi from school buildings? Question number 4, how can wheat, soy and other cereal crops survive being sprayed with Roundup when 15 years ago it used to kill them, and kill them dead? Question number 5, all of the genetically modified organisms and foods in Australia have been approved by the Office of Gene Technology Regulator and FSANZ and assessed as being safe. Why is the human safety dose 437,500 times higher than that for rats? These are questions of science, and these are situated in communities, and this is what the kind of evolution we're thinking about, the kinds of issues that schools and curricula are not actually dealing with. Okay, and they're coming from outside spaces. Let's think about it. Schools are controlled by governments. Governments essentially are the last place to hear or identify or act upon real social issues. They usually come from other spaces. So what we need to do is we need to invert that pyramid. And we're looking here at this new science model of what we call Earth Ed or Earth Education. And it is being modelled right across the world, and schools are picking this up in alternate school structures. And it's growing. It's very much as an organisation of science teaching. Question 1, why can't any of our global telcos get indemnity insurance? Well, because they make mobile phones. And let's face it, with mobile phones, there's strong medical research that indicates they're very highly correlated to the formation of brain tumours. Brain tumours have a latency period of 12 to 15 years. Mobile phones became most popular around about mid-2000s. And so we are now just entering into the period where we're starting to see, or beginning to see, the appearance of that rush or that epidemic of brain tumours. The recent research came out just earlier this month. If you use your mobile phone for 30 minutes a day, for a period of 10 years, you're increasing your chance of a brain tumour by 170%. Now, insurance companies won't insure the telcos because they know there is a tsunami of claims coming. Okay? They know this. It's there, it's in the evidence, it's in the science, it's just sitting there. 1973, the average Aussie bloke sperm count dropped by 49% since 9. That's massive. Where does your husband or partner or friend or you, Where do you carry your mobile phone? If you're carrying it in your front pocket, be very careful, okay, because the ghoulies are being affected here. You really need to think about what you're doing there. If you don't understand that, check the science. Why have schools in Cyprus withdrawn Wi-Fi from school buildings? Again, electromagnetic fields. Have a think about it. Have a think about what's going on. Houses being plied with solar systems. We have constant electromagnetic circuits running through our houses. Think about the impact this is having on our health. Cyprus has felt so strongly about this, they've withdrawn Wi-Fi from schools. The government stepped in and said, we don't want our students exposed to this. Yet at night time, turn your Wi-Fi off. Break at least one circuit in your house. We look at solar systems converting DC energy to AC. What happens? I mean, it breaks it down. It does the conversion. But what it does, it stores what we call the dirty energy, the residue. It stores it in the electric circuitry of your home. So at any given point, you are surrounded by dirty energy. Now, these are all great environmental solutions, but, you know, when we look at science as a human endeavour, there are outcomes that we don't see, that we don't predict. How can wheat, soy and other cereal crops survive being sprayed Roundup? Well, because it's been genetically modified. Okay, the crop has been genetically modified with a new genome. That genome now makes it, which essentially is Roundup. So they've strengthened the crop by breeding it with Roundup or inserting it with Roundup genes. And what's actually happened is it's now resistant to Roundup. But unfortunately, Roundup is a product that doesn't break down, even when it hits our bodies. It, believe it or not, gets stored in your liver. So constantly, here we are creating toxic food. Now, these are all really obvious science issues, but they're not making it into science classrooms. We're not making it into science curricula. And this is the push of the new science direction. The final point, all GM organisations have been approved, but look at this figure. The human safety dose for genetically modified organisms is 437,500 times higher than that for rats. Studies done on rats. Michael Angelo from the UK, famous biochemist, recently published just last month his most recent study, which indicates that rats are demonstrating high degrees of liver dysfunction when they're absorbing glyphosate rates lower, 437,500 times lower than the rates that are in or the established safety levels for Australian genetically modified foods. So if that's happening, why is that happening? You know, whose research is informing that? These are significant questions of science. These are the ones which we ultimately need to start getting our futures to consider. So the purpose of this session is, you know, at least this point in this session, is to ask what science education is for. And science education stems back a long way. Okay, it really is education defined by Asadorian. Is the process of facilitating learning, and that's essentially what it's been. It's been a part of human societies long before we were even human. Okay, when we were, you know, in a different version of ourselves, Homo sapien, etc. Humans are not the only species that transmit knowledge from one individual to another. We see it with chimpanzees, we see it with dolphins. They both teach their young specialised foraging and hunting techniques, and known only to their communities. And with dolphins, certain hunting techniques are specific to certain dolphin pods. So we can see knowledge transmission is not specific to us as human beings. And we can see also that it's not specific to us as human beings and animals, because we talk and scientists document that, you know, bacteria can actually learn, plants can learn. The emergence of superbugs, you know, we can see that they adopt these learning behaviours. And learning is a natural part of being alive. And you know, essentially what it does is it increases the odds of staying alive. And this is why it's such an important component of our future and of our curriculum. And the role of education, ultimately, in this new and changing world, may just be to facilitate survival. It's no longer about credentialism. Schools teach our kids to be good employees and to perform tasks and to be good citizens. But essentially, perhaps our agenda's running a little bit deeper than that now. Perhaps we're starting to look at schools needing to address these survival issues. The emergence of the ACS. Now, we know that in the year 2012, Australian schools embarked on a new curriculum model. However, not every school follows it. You know, it's less than 50% of schools fit the actual inquiry ACS model. They all teach units from the ACS, but again, a lot of them do it in their old content and fact-driven formats. For humans to survive in the future, we need to systemically rethink education on a planet that's undergoing rapid ecological change. Now, we talked about that earlier, the year 2030, what it's going to look like. Essentially, what we need to do with learners is provide them with tools and strategies. They need to question the current socio-cultural reality, to become bold leaders who will help pull us back from the brink of ecocide and usher in a new sustainable future. This is the agenda for 2013. But even that's not enough, because given how much damage to human civilization has already been done, you know, our students are also going to need to learn how to prepare for and adapt to ecological shifts that are already locked into their futures. And we're asking them to do this in ways that help both restore the Earth systems and preserve their own humanity. So we're starting to see the need for a new kind of educational priority. And this is coming very much through in the international curricula. We can't say that Australia's leading this challenge. Australia seems to be going the other way, back towards standardised education, whereas a lot of schools globally are breaking free. As I said earlier in this discussion, you know, in 2017, there are several school sites all around the world who've already identified the challenge of 2013 and are modelling solutions to it. So they're talking about eco-literacy. They're talking about moral or ethical education. We're talking about systems thinking, where, you know, one hand does need to know what the other's doing, or at least the consequences of what the other's doing. And finally, we're talking about critical thinking. And these are only a few of the skills that are coming through this new science, this new global science curricula. We can look at a changing planet, and we can talk about this. At the moment, we've got $570 billion a year spent around the world to promote the consumption of consumer goods. Okay, so once upon a time, we actually believed that we would have a leisure society, that technology would make all of this easier. Instead, what it's done is actually create a consumer-driven model. Now, we can look at our climate models. They're predicting temperature increases of 2 to 6 degrees Celsius in the next century, continuing well beyond that. The consequences, we're going to see many more metres of sea level, acidification of the world's oceans, dramatic changes in rainfall patterns, droughts, disasters and famines. You know, we haven't had rain in Townsville for 6 months. Okay, and you know, down south we're seeing floods in previously what they're calling 1 in 100-year events. So we're seeing real fluctuations and variations in our climatic patterns. And we're also crossing several other planetary boundaries too. We're looking at, you know, how our farming methods, we're disrupting the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles. We're depleting biodiversity. We're spewing enormous amounts of chemicals into the air, the soil and the water. And we've brought about a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene. And this comes from the work of Crutzen back in 2000, who talks about the Anthropocene as being a man-made geological epoch. In other words, it finally can be documented geologically that our impact on the planet has brought about these changes. And yet, in the social domain and the political domain, you know, we have climate change deniers very active, which is okay. I mean, it's a democracy and everything is a contest. But at the same time, we are now starting to see some go-ahead schools embrace this and start to, particularly those schools that are vulnerable, some in the Pacific Islands, particularly vulnerable schools, some in Finland, Sweden, very, very strong in this agenda. The US, we're starting to see some areas there emerging, Canada, but particularly in the Pacific Islands, those areas which are going to be most vulnerable to sea level rise. These are the ones who are coming up with the most innovative science curricula. And the human population, look, we're adding 83 million family members each year. So by the year 2050, this is going to be 9.7 billion. Clearly, you know, the ACS talks about sustainability. How is the science we're teaching at the moment actually addressing sustainability? How hard is it to find that link to sustainability as a priority in many of the units that we're exploring? The new world, new lives. Okay, let's have a look at this little expose here. It's let's have a look at this little video. What we can see from that, obviously, is some significant, demographic changes in just a period of 5 years. The Indian and Chinese migration, the corresponding rise in alternate religions, and for the 8% of people who declare themselves to be other religions, believe it or not, there were 67,000 Jedi Knights in that population. So, Australia, going forward, is we are changing. We can see the change in language. English language down from 76 to 72% as the principal language. Diversity. We're looking at different cultures. We're looking at more open borders. This can only increase. And the question for facing us, and therefore facing us as teachers in our professions, how do we provide fulfilling lives for 8 to 10 billion people as Earth systems are declining rapidly? And they are. These cannot be consumer-based lives. So we can't sell people comfort. We can't sell them consumption. Because ecologically speaking, this can't be sustained. We need to talk about decent lives that offer access to vital services, basic health cares, education, livelihood opportunities, and essential freedoms. Essential freedoms, that's a really important part. Schooling today tends to ignore the massive changes that are looming. And by schooling, let's narrow this down to science education, because that is our domain, that is our challenge. It offers little in the form of preparation for slowing those changes or coping with them. Now, a new schooling model is emerging. This is the global model I was referring to. It's called Earth Education, and it can be mapped onto our Australian curriculum of science. It really is very much based in the International Baccalaureate model, in the Steiner School and Emilio Reggio models. But what we're talking about here in this little diagram is a connection between education for sustainability and education for resilience. So notice there's no content there. You'll notice there's no Australian curriculum statements. There's no elaborations. What we've got here is sustainability. We've got social imperatives and resilience, which is a personal imperative. We are trying to create resilient students and resilient individuals who are informed and concerned and located in ways that they can be sustainable in their practices. And our goal is to design curricula around lessons and projects that maximise both education for sustainability and education for resilience. Now, last week I talked about robotics and the first Lego League challenge and how that can be a simulated game which empowers individuals and students to actually come up with social solutions. This whole model is built on that. We talk about Earth-centric leadership as the principle, as the high point on the model, and this is based on Paulo Freire's notion of critical consciousness. That is, we must identify the hypocrisy in the world and be aware of it. And if we are able to identify it and be aware of it, then as educators and as schools, we're able to actually survive and swim in that river. A lot of these schools focus social entrepreneurship. Now, this is a big push right throughout Vietnam and Thailand, where schools are actually educating social entrepreneurs to develop resources and set up small industries for their local communities. And of course, this is built on the concept of deep social learning and deep connection. We're starting to see that these schools spread right across the world are solution-oriented, that they're creative and how they're addressing local problems. And we see also that they're dealing with moral, ethical, social and emotional issues. And often they're issues, particularly in the Pacific Islands, that don't connect with their own activities. For instance, Pacific Islands are slowly going underwater because of the behaviour of a lot of Western countries. Now, what we're talking here about is the recognition of interdependence. That we are, the decisions we make, the actions we take, and this is somehow reflected in the ACS when we talk about human endeavour and the consequences of science, but very much how to reconnect with nature. And in Australia, for instance, we're seeing the bush kindergarten movement in the early childhood sector, built, of course, on the European, Friday in a forest model, where it began with one teacher taking his students back to the forest every Friday to educate them. It went viral, and it became now a whole movement where they have forest kindergartens. In Australia, it's become the bush kindergarten. And again, the fifth principle here, humans depend on the planet. So we are earth independent. We are interdependent by our actions and by our decisions. We need creative solutions to come with that. Those creative solutions must be based on deep learning, experiential as well as theoretical, as well as academic, and as well as research-based. And then we need Earth-centric leadership. We need people who are aware of the hypocrisy in government, in policy, in a whole range of areas to actually lead this agenda. And once all of this is in place, we have an Earth education core principle. We have the structures in place. Now, the ACS is not that different, but definitely Earth education model is more, I guess, extreme, more focused, but primarily its focus is here on sustainability and resilience. And these are powerful models. And this is the area where teachers are being asked to step into, not as ideologues, but as educators, as guides on the side, as meddlers in the middle. The ideologue, the sage on the stage, needs to take a back seat, because what we're talking about here is solution-oriented, community-based, social entrepreneur curricula which deal with the deep learning community issues. It's very organic. It's not theoretical. A little task for you. Here's a continuum, this green line. It starts at one end, goes to another. At one end is uneducated, at the other end is educated. I want you to think for a moment where you would put schooling and why you would put it there. Now, a normal association is once someone is educated is that they've been schooled, that schooling equates to education. But recent research suggests this is not the case. What we're seeing is schooling can actually be quite uneducational for many students who go through it. And we can see this in our large rates of disengagement. So let's take a little bit of a history lesson here. So in Australia, let's go back to settlements. Now, the first colony took off. There was no such thing as school. You know, the only thing there were rum dens, and that they were quite frequent little social places and hubs. There were also brothels. They were also quite frequent and social. There was no such thing as a school. Homeschooling was the norm. Any of the free settlers that came to Australia brought with them a nanny, brought with them a teacher. So these Protestant, Methodist, middle class, middle and upper class people who came to establish the colony did so with a schooling model for which they were responsible. Homeschooling was the norm. But something happened. Something happened around about this time. The leading class essentially were unschooled. They had their education in-house at home. But with the advent of industrialisation, we started to see mothers, fathers engaged in long days of work in factory and mass production processes. And these people essentially were the hands of industry, that they were the poorer people, and they tended to be, given the nature of our society and structure, post-settlement, they tended to be Catholic. And of course they had high rates of birth, and of course they had large families. They also had high rates of child mortality. And both parents working long days, the net result was these kids were running the streets in an urban situation. There was crime, there was misdemeanour, there was upset, there was, kids were coming to harm. And so, the religious classes got busy, they got organised, and the first Education Act was passed in the Australian colony to compulsorily educate the feral Catholic masses. That's essentially what it was, to educate the Catholic masses. And they were feral, let's face it, they were unparented, they were unsupervised, and they were at harm, and they were at risk of doing harm. So there was a social imperative for doing it. But notice that a lot of the wealthy industrial Protestant class, their kids never went to these schools. These schools were very much like a factory. They were like a detention centre. And the wealthy class, their kids were still educated. The future leaders were still educated in a home-based environment. And given this split, schooling in Australia was born. So it's little wonder that it has an identity crisis, 150 years later. There's lots of arguments against schooling. And there's lots of literature being published around this. And we, of course, here in Queensland, there's a huge movement right across Australia, the homeschooling movement. We see alternate schools emerging and flourishing. Okay, community schools, Steiner schools, baccalaureate schools, Reggio Emilio schools. I mean, they still have to register. Their teachers have to be accredited. But their ethos is very, very different. We've got the Ananda Marga School down in the Sunshine Coast. Now, the argument of alternate school is that schooling is a form of misophody. And misophody, basically, if you don't know the definition of it, it's basically a hatred or a dislike of children. So schooling shouldn't be confused with education. Education is about facilitating learning. Schooling is quite a different thing. It's a fundamental structure in conditioning societal acceptance of the domination of children in other registers. So if we accept that children need to be controlled, if we accept that children need to be subjugated to a compulsory schooling process, to a compulsory curriculum where their choices are taken away, to the length of days, to how their time is used, to after-school activities, if we accept all of this stuff, then essentially what we're accepting is a legitimate domination of children in a whole range of other registers. Okay? It creates a dichotomy. The adult-child, the teacher-student dichotomy, and they are very much power relationships. Let's not kid ourselves. This is a hegemonic relationship here. It's a hegemonic dichotomy, and it's about the subordination of children with a misguided notion that somehow they're incapable of autonomy. Okay, that somehow they're incapable of autonomy. We know that they don't come to us. Those people with teaching experience, we know they don't come to us as blank sheets. They come very much as formed individuals with real wants, real desires, and real aspirations. So in this light, schooling represents the interests and can be said in the most extreme cases. Paolo Freire, for instance, writes about the pedagogy of liberation, of emancipation. He talks about schooling representing the interests of oppression. It moulds societal consciousness so that students learn to accept the conditions of subjugation. This is good for me, I'll keep going. Whereas education is the different process. We look at John Dewey back in 1916. He talked about education as a process of self-discovery. It's an awakening to one's potential. And, around us we are surrounded by people, teachers, other students who have a desire to see these abilities realised. It's a celebration, education. Schooling, however, is all about moulding societal consciousness. And let's face it, that the meta-narratives in our society these days are really economic. It's all about economic growth. And so we are, moulded. Our schools have picked up this role of moulding students for economic citizenship. So we talk about the subjugation of the child. And there's a fabulous article here I could refer you to. It's written by a guy called Simon Springer, and he comes out of the University of Victoria in the States, and he writes some brilliant stuff here about anti-schooling, or what he calls the unschooling movement. But he's really unique in his perspective, because he says, let's not pull kids out of school, let's pull school out of kids. And so he's got this real interesting inversion, and he says a lot of it comes down to the role of the teacher. So what we have to do to ensure the absence of coercion in education is get kids to explore, so inquiry-based learning, making their own decisions about what their interests are and how those curiosities might be fulfilled. Now wait a minute, I know what you're saying. I'm not trained as a teacher to run 25 different activities in my class at one time. I don't have the time to do it. And yet this is the first generation where, not the first, but I guess we're the first industry, as an education industry, where time has dictated our practices. Once upon a time, back in the eras of homeschooling or unschooling, it was the education process that drove the time. Now it's been inverted. And we also need to present a broad range of opportunities. The decision about what path to follow should be determined by the child. So we're talking open inquiry here. And we can smell some of these in the ACS. We can smell the potential. But ask yourself, is it happening? When bound to a classroom, we often mistake obedience for education. The kids worked hard, they had their heads down, everyone handed in a piece of paper, but those bits of paper really weren't that exciting. They did what I expected them to do. I still don't know what they know or don't know. When children explore the world through unschooling, that is a non-school environment. And what is the definition of unschooling? Life. When children explore the world through life experience, they live in their own creative potential. They open an aperture on alternative ontologies, and an ontology is a journey. So, once you get away from a focus on a curriculum and you actually look at your life, you're then starting to question, as Piaget in 1962 said, what is key to my life? Who is the scientist I need to be within that life? What ontology, what journey do I need to take? What passions do I have? But don't worry, we'll put you in year 4 and we'll beat that out of you. So education, schooling and unschooling. Most children live their lives sitting behind a desk being told what to do and when to do it. Let's face it. The function of schooling is not to instill an education, but to instill a mechanism through which hierarchy and authority are imparted as though they are the very oxygen and necessary sustenance that sustains our lives. Springer, very, very florid writer, comes up with some really, really wonderful analogies. But his thinking goes way back beyond, way back to Ivan Illich, and great philosophers like Illich. Illich talks about education primarily as indoctrination. And we've all experienced what Springer and Illich talk about, that the cruelty of schooling. We've all been signalled out by a teacher. We've all been identified by a principal for having the wrong coloured shoes. People experience bullying from peers on a random basis. There's always the teacher who's snide and sarcastic. Schooling can be a cruel experience. And how can learning possibly thrive in that environment? Now, I'm just posing this as questions, because you are pre-service teachers. You are entering this environment, and your awareness of what you're entering into is critical. Teaching and learning models are built on the subordination of children. Let's face it, it's a strong word, but it is. And it's based on a misguided notion that they are somehow incapable of autonomy, and it reinforces this dichotomous understanding of adult child, teacher, student. This is why we have an independent declaration for the rights of children, okay? Because they're seen as a chattel. They're seen not as adults, but as mini adults, as something less than an adult. So we have to protect their rights. And this philosophy, even though it's well conceived, it can be limiting. We come up with two different worlds, and here's the work of Barvey in 2004. We come up with two distinct words, teach and learn, and both suggest two processes that are independent of one another. Well, we would be the only species in the origin of the planet which separates teach and learn. We would be the only ones. Lions teach their young. Dolphins teach their young. Chimpanzees teach their young. They teach each other. Okay? We are the only species that separates teach and learn. And again, is this one of the reasons why we've drifted away from our focus, why we struggle to understand our professional goals? So it's a dual-edged sword. And again, let's go back to Dewey in 1916. Education should not be mistaken for schooling, and that's the whole purpose here. Schooling is due for reform. Science education is due for reform. And so it's the practice of freedom, says Dewey, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. Or, says Freire, it can be taken differently. It can be taken as another edge of a sword. It can be taken as an instrument that is used to facilitate an integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity. So is it about freedom or is it about conformity? Education is about freedom. Schooling, unfortunately, has become about conformity. Think about your experience on prac. Which one do you identify with? Holt was extremely radical in his educational views. He said education was merely a cipher for the ugly and anti-human business of people shaping. Isn't that a beautiful analogy? Everything that a teacher really reacts against. It's the ugly and anti-human business of people shaping. Teaching becomes an assumption of the inferiority of the student. We've got to beat them into shape. We've got to show them who they are and what they need to do. Rollo, 2015, more contemporary, is through this understanding of childhood difference as inferior that we come to the very idea of progress and development, where the entire notion of human advancement is defined through misopity. That is, through the dislike of children. And, the ACS, curriculum, state government policy, are they really examples of institutionalized misopity? They are getting the students to conform to certain patterns of study, to age-based levels of study, to processes that they must follow, to assessment bands that are similar and identical, and so no one is differentiated. They go through different units and different processes. Is this an institutionalized misopity? Where is the freedom? And if we're talking, as Dennis Goodrum does, about genuine inquiry in science, then how can that be the case when we're being told what we're supposed to inquire into? Ivan Illich, a brilliant philosopher. If you do get the chance, read some of his work, perhaps over Christmas when you're not studying. But he says school prepares for the alienating institutionalization of life by teaching the need to be taught. Now, I have a Labrador. My Labrador has an eating problem. My lifelong goal, she's 12 years of age, has been to help her work with that eating problem. Anything she sees, she eats. So I've taught my dog that she needs to be taught. Perhaps she does. It'd be harmful to her. But is that the same method we apply to our students? That what we do, schooling, is all about teaching people that they are not enough, that they need to be taught. Who is going to be there to celebrate with them what it is that they do well? What happens to their incentive to grow in independence? These are all questions we need to ask ourselves. And bringing you to John Gatto. Now, John Gatto is an American State Teacher of the Year. He's a principal of one of America's most difficult schools. He went into that school and turned it around and became something of a universal legend, John Gatto. If you get the chance, if you've got a little bit of time, just Google John Taylor Gatto. Here's a little video that he made, which I think you'll find quite enjoyable. And it's very much talking about Erickson's stages of education and schooling. And he attributes 6 purposes to schooling. Please have a listen.
Would be solved. For who can argue against the truth that childish and childlike people are far easier to manage than critically trained, self-reliant ones? And now you're ready to hear the 6 purposes of modern schooling taken directly from Dr. Inglis's book. The first function of schooling is adjustive. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. That's fixed habits of reaction. Notice that this precludes critical judgment completely. Notice, too, that requiring obedience to stupid orders is a much better test of function 1 than following sensible orders ever could be. You don't know whether people are reflexively obedient unless they'll march right off the cliff. Second is the diagnostic function. School is to determine each student's proper social role, logging the evidence mathematically and anecdotally on cumulative records. You probably thought that the kid or parents or neighbors or the region, circumstances. No, school is to determine your proper social role, and they're to fix you in that role mathematically on their cumulative records. Next comes the sorting function. School sorts children by training individuals only so far as their likely destination in the social machine, not one step beyond. Keep in mind, you're not listening to John Gatto. You're listening to the man for whom the honor lecture in education at Harvard is named. The fourth function is conformity. As much as possible, kids are to be made alike. Whatever the background they come from, they're to be made alike. This is not done from any passion for egalitarian ideals, but so that their future behavior will be mathematically predictable in service to market research and government research. Next comes the hygienic function. This one's my favorite. This has nothing to do with individual health, but it has a lot to do with the health of the race, at least as Inglis or Darwin or his first cousin Galton saw it. Hygiene is a polite way of saying that school is expected to accelerate natural selection by tagging the unfit so clearly. That's what all those little humiliations from first grade on, that's what all the posted list of ranked grades are about, so clearly that the unfit will drop from the reproduction sweepstakes, either in despair or because their likely mates will have accepted the school's judgment of them as terminally inferior. And last comes a fancy Latin word, the propedeutic function. That's a fancy word meaning that a small fraction of lucky kids will quietly be taught how to take over management of this continuing project. Guardians of a population deliberately dumbed down and rendered childlike in order that government and economic life can be managed with a minimum of hassle. It's that low-down, nitty-gritty, common purpose, not Marx's grand warfare between classes and greedy captains of industry. It's simply so that management will have a minimum of hassles.
John Gatto. If you do find the time, Google him, John Taylor Gatto. This was his elaboration of, as you said, he referred to the Harvard educational lecture each year. He's given several of those. So he's no lightweight, and the person he quotes is the person whom that lecture series was named after and is still delivered. Of course, very close friends of Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and of course headed up a lot of the US educational reforms and the backlash against standardisation. But John Gatto comes up and says what our schools really are, and they're laboratories of experimentation on young minds, drill centres for the habits and attitudes that corporate society demands. Mandatory education serves children only incidentally. Its real purpose is to turn them into servants. So this is pretty strong language. And the reason, the purpose of this final lecture is to challenge you as people going out there with a mandate. You have an area of responsibility called science education. You have a world facing by 2030 some very, very obvious challenges. Where do you sit in that? What is your repertoire of practice? What are your values? How are you going to align yourself with the agendas that we need to address versus the ones that we're being told to address? Now, there's nothing wrong with good corporate citizens. We all need them. But is this the goal of schooling? That's what you've got to ask yourself. And the shift is happening now. On the left-hand side, we have the happy hens. On the right-hand side, we have the explorers and the engagers. All around them, these are Queensland alternate schools and programs. They're here in Queensland. They are organisations, teachers who've left the profession and gone out and picked up the challenge of environmental and earth education, of the new sciences, of creating a curriculum that is aligned. And we talked about this earlier in the year with John Biggs and his work of cognitive alignment and constructive alignment. We're talking about a curriculum that is aligned to the needs of communities and societies, and a curriculum that is so aware and so sensitive that it's aligning itself to the needs of a society that is coming into fruition by 2030. So it's futuristic too. So we're seeing, look at some of the names: Barefoot Nature Play, Beach Care, the Sea School, Green Edge Catalysts, Nature Play. Look what's happening here. This is the Bush Kindergarten movement, manifesting through primary years. It won't be long until we start to see, if we haven't already, Mullaney State High School become pretty close to this, models of secondary schooling where we're starting to see the new science, the new world agendas coming into being. It's already happening. These careers are out there for teachers. In 12 years' time, perhaps this is the new norm. This is the new norm for science education. The educational alternatives to schooling? Well, let's face it. This is my last slide. They are there. We've just seen a whole range of what's happening. We've seen different community schools, the Charterstown Schools of Distance Education, our largest school in Queensland. It doesn't have very many students in its classrooms. They're all out there in the world, in their own worlds, some in prison, some in custodial sentences, some on remote properties. Many who don't fit into the traditional schooling system. So these are kids who've fallen out of the system and are now being educated via distance mode, where they've got a place in their world where their science works for them. Now, John Kabat-Zinn, a fabulous psychologist an author and publisher, and also a medical doctor. Became famous because he introduced the concepts of mindfulness into the treatment of mental health patients and patients with chronic pain. He has this wonderful book called The Full Catastrophe. And in The Full Catastrophe, he says, his punchline is, wherever you are, there you are. And what is our alternative to schooling? Well, the unschooling movement says, wherever you are, there you are. Unschooling, recognises that whatever we are doing and wherever we are always right where we need to be, doing exactly what we need to be doing. I must declare my eldest daughter was homeschooled. Not for the entire of her career, but certainly for years 8 and 9. It was a fabulous period in her life where she grew as a person incredibly, explored music, explored art, also became obviously quite literate and quite numerate, has gone on to an amazing career and with a bright perspective, because it was right for her. My other daughter went straight through school with an OP1. That was right for her. But at the moment, what options are we providing for students outside of the one-size-fits-all? And if one size has to fit all, then what do we do as teachers in our science curriculum? Because schooling reinforces the excesses and absurdities of a contemporary world. Because let's face it, by its sheer nature, it is designed to mould people and make them fit in. Anarchism is not a goal of our schooling system. I mean, at school I was a bit of an anarchist. I didn't even finish my high school. I was asked to leave. I wasn't expelled, but I was asked to leave because I didn't fit in. Mind you, it was a very conservative Catholic school. But schooling needs to provide. It needs to make space for individual kids. And we need to put down the curriculum map and enjoy the scenery. How many schools are stressed? How many teachers are stressed to the eyeballs? A study of Finnish schools represents Finnish teachers as some of the least stressed professionals in Finland. Why? They go and they take an hour for lunch. They have coffee between classes. They do all of these things. Sometimes in their classroom, because of the heating and the wet weather outside, they have barefoot classrooms. Take the journey without a predetermined destination. Let's be inquiry-based. Now, if we are inquiry-based, then, how do we deal with all this paperwork, all this standardised work that's stressing teachers out so much? These are issues that you need to think about. The ACS is an attempt to do this because it sets up structured patterns of learning and pathways, and the role of the teacher then becomes one interaction. It becomes very learner-centred, inquiry-driven. You're constantly there in a variety of roles as sage, guide on the side, mentor, meddler in the middle, and it's open-ended and negotiated curriculum units. It's a middle path, as the Buddhists would say, but it's not an ideal one. Now, at the moment, the ACS does promote an absence of coercion in education. It's very student-centred. We've got children exploring science for themselves. They're making their own decisions about what their interests are. They're investigating, predicting, observing, and explaining their outcomes. So we're at least addressing some of their curiosities. But I think their curiosities go further than magnets. I think their curiosities extend beyond forces. They really want to know, and they want to feel effective and resilient in being able to sustain their view of a workable and fair and just world. So this final session is all about getting you to think about your role in that.